The International Monetary Fund says the UK is expected to be the only major economy to fall into a recession this year, predicting a contraction of 0.6% in the UK's gross domestic product, while upgrading the forecast for many other countries. We're joined now by John O'Connell, Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance. Thanks so much for joining me on this. I guess the first question is the extent to which the UK stands out in the data that we've got today compared to other economies, and why the difference?
Yeah, it does seem to be a stark difference, particularly at a time when inflation seems to be easing and supply chains seem to be correcting themselves after a couple of years of disruption. But, you know, IMF forecasts do tend to be wider than mark, but at least we can use this report to talk about why the UK economy hasn't been performing as well as it should be, even relative to our peers in Europe and elsewhere. But the IMF talks about fiscal policy, big spending interventions on things like energy bills, and we know that there's a big problem with workers over 50 leaving the labour market and weak business investment. But we've got a budget coming up in March, and it seems like it's time for the government to set out how it can get costs under control so it can make room for some targeted tax cuts that will help to boost investment and get growth going, because that's what this report's all about after all, is economic growth.
I mean, and many of these institutions, not just the IMF, don't necessarily have a perfect track record in predicting growth going forward, though, as we said, there's a clear difference here in terms of what they're thinking for the rest of the Eurozone and the US. They're upgrading their forecasts, and the UK, where they're downgrading it. In fact, could the biggest difference there in the area be on being too optimistic about other places like continental Europe and the US?
Possibly. But again, you know, some of the background economic factors are looking slightly rosier than they were perhaps last year and the year before. So we are starting to see inflation, if not cool immediately, but there's forecasts that the inflation will start to come down over 2023. And as I said, supply chains are starting to correct after certain years of disruption, and indeed energy prices might be set to head down as well, albeit maybe not landing as cheaply as they were pre the war in Russia. So there are some sort of economic factors that are lead us to some slightly rosier conclusions than may have been the case. But, you know, it's the job of politicians now to prove the IMF wrong. And that, you know, is only a couple of months away now in March. They have an opportunity to set out a fiscal framework to allow the UK economy to grow, to allow businesses to get on, to invest in capital, machinery, all the things that are good for economic growth, and allow the UK to prove the doubters at the IMF wrong.
And your view in the best way to achieve that is making fiscal policy a little bit more expansionary?
Well, yeah, and, you know, I think some targeted tax cuts, you know, a corporation tax increase of 6 percentage points at a time when we want companies to be investing in capital equipment, machinery, hiring new workers, expanding, growing, is the wrong move. And, you know, we think that the budget is a perfect time to be saying, okay, you know, given the prevailing economic conditions being slightly better than what we thought they were, we've now got room to give businesses and taxpayers a bit of a break to help boost economic growth. Because it's not, you know, politicians can't really control economic growth. That's down to the businesses and entrepreneurs and the hardworking tax-paying Brits who help drive that growth. So let's give them the room to do so. Let's use the opportunity of the budget to step back and allow the great British businesses that we have to thrive.
I mean, of course, it's only been 4 or 5 months since a plan that involved or was central to that plan was cutting taxes, was widely derided, and of course led to a change in government. So do you support the initial steps that Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak took not to cut taxes, but you just think that there's now space to do so? Or in fact, were Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng always in the right?
The Chancellor and the Prime Minister had to take action given the what was happening in the bond markets and this kind of thing. But the key with tax cuts is they need to be twinned with spending restraint. What happened in the mini budget was a huge expansionary measure on energy bills, huge amounts of public spending at the same time as big tax cuts, which meant deficit funded tax cuts. That's not what we want to see. We want to see some spending restraint to leave the room for those targeted tax cuts. So it's about the government stepping back a bit, leaving that space for some tax cuts in the area that will help best on economic growth. So it's a twin track approach rather than just huge amounts of spending increases with a load of tax cuts. It needs to be a balance.
As we look again at this IMF report, and it leads to very negative sounding headlines for the government, growth worse than Russia and things like that. Do you feel like we're at a nadir when it comes to talk about the UK economy, or will it get worse before it gets better? Do you think that this could be, in fact, a turning point?
There are some issues with the UK economy. We need to we need to allow some supply side reform. We need some economic reforms in that area. We need to take advantage of things like reforms to the pension system to allow much more investment. What we're really behind on in the UK is business investment, and we need lots more of that to create the economic growth, which creates jobs, allows families to look after themselves, and indeed creates the tax revenue for public services. So there are some things to do, but at the same time, like I said, some economic conditions are starting to look slightly better than they were before. So we should be positive. We've got fantastic companies in this country who do amazing things, and we need to give them all the support we can. And that does mean stepping back a little bit, maybe not increasing corporation tax by 6 percentage points, maybe starting to look at the business rate system that really hamstring lots of small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly outside the M25. Making these kinds of measures will allow us to take the opportunities that we might have in the next year or so, rather than really tightening the noose and not allowing companies to create the economic growth that we so need to help put food on our families' tables.
John O'Connell, thanks so much.